I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Greenblatt, who will actually broaden the topic here a little bit to evaluate the future energy greenhouse gas reductions in California and talk a little bit about his studies and some challenges to get there.
Right, so this is going to depart quite a bit actually from what you've heard earlier, because I was a member of a committee that formed in 2009 actually to look at California's energy future through 2050. And this report, the summary report, was finally released last May, and we have several follow-up reports that have been coming out every few months, and there's a little bit more to go. So I'm going to sort of focus on the renewables section of that report, but we actually looked across the entire California energy economy at all sectors: transportation, industry, building, direct fuel use, as well as the use of electricity. So the context is, as I hope all of you know, that AB 32 requires a reduction of overall greenhouse gas emissions back to the 1990 level by 2020, which is about a 25% drop from where we would otherwise be without this law. But there was also a Governor Schwarzenegger's executive order passed in 2005 that called for an 80% reduction by 2050. And unless a future governor overturns this, this is law, and the state needs to start thinking about how we're going to get there. This is obviously a much more ambitious target than the 2020 goal, because we're looking at reducing basically by a factor of 5 in the next 40 years. And it's really essentially getting to about as close to zero as we can, because what's left in the system, as I will show you, are really things that are almost impossible to get out without some significant advances in technology. But the point of our study was to figure out, could we do it, and if so, what would the major options be? It was not an economic optimization study, but it was really a proof of principle. Of course, we did leave out technologies that we thought would be really exorbitant in cost, but that was a bit of a secondary context to just where the technical feasibility is. So the logic was to essentially eliminate fossil fuels wherever possible, unless those emissions could be sequestered through carbon capture and sequestration. So the logic is similar to the loading order that we saw in a couple of the earlier talks, that first we figure out how much efficiency we can realistically deploy across all sectors, which decreases the need for both electricity and fuels. But then a key next step is to identify where we could actually provide the same energy service using electricity rather than combustion of fuels. And a good example, or convert to hydrogen fuel, that's a secondary consideration. And as a good example of that is the use of an electric heat pump to provide both air conditioning as well as heating or water heating in a building. It's a technology that is now emerging as a commercially competitive market option. And so we essentially identified technologies such as that, as well as, of course, electric drive vehicles, and figured out, if we aggressively pursue this, how much of the fuel use could be displaced that way. And then with the demand that we would have left for electricity and fuels, how do we decarbonize the electricity, and how do we decarbonize the fuel supply in order to reduce the emissions from those sources as much as possible. And a key thing in the electric sector, which I'll focus on, is what do we do about balancing the differences between supply and demand, especially what you're going to find in an increasingly intermittent renewable system. So this is just a cartoon showing the 4 actions in case you didn't get them the first time around. This is a box that we found has been kind of helpful in describing it. It's very simple. It's just demand for fuels and electricity is on the x-axis showing how much there is, and then on the y-axis is greenhouse gas intensity. Whoops. So if you look at the area, it's the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted. The border of the purple box indicates where the prediction of where we would be in 2050 if we did nothing, and this is the target that we're getting to. So it's a very significant reduction. So as I said, we didn't do an economic analysis, but we did look at all the technologies and essentially bin them in terms of technical readiness, and focus for the most part on ones that were considered either deployed at scale now, like solar and wind and the electric vehicles that we see, starting to be on the roads now, or has been demonstrated but is not quite available at scale. And we left out things that were still research concepts but identified if they might be important future technology options. Just to give you a picture in the numbers, energy demand for the whole state in 2005 was just shy of 300 terawatt hours, or billion kilowatt hours per year, and supply of fuels about 36 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent, which includes diesel and jet fuel and other fuels, all sort of put in similar units. In 2050, under our business as usual scenario, the electricity demand would roughly double, and the reason is that the population of California is projected to increase quite dramatically, about a 50% increase from where we are today, so more than 50 million people from the roughly 35 that we have. Plus increases in GDP, hopefully, will drive use of electricity upwards and dramatically increase the use for fuels. Under our scenario where we do pretty aggressive electrification and efficiency in all sectors, this number actually goes up, because while it would go down from efficiency, we then shifting a lot of the fuel use into the electric sector, so we wind up with still roughly a doubling of electricity demand from today, but a pretty significant reduction in fuel. However, that number is not zero. So essentially, we need to think about an electricity grid in 2050 that is twice as large as today's and generates almost no emissions. This just illustrates, again, graphically, the total emissions statewide if we did nothing, and then if we sequentially applied these four actions, we found in our modeling that we could get down to roughly twice the target level. And this was rather sobering. We really looked at this conclusion hard to make sure that we understood why we couldn't get any further. And of course, there's some wiggle room here, but our basic conclusion is if we deploy technologies that we know about now, we think we can get to a 60% reduction rather than 80%. Getting that extra factor of 2 is going to require innovation. And that's really one of the main take-homes. An example of that innovation, this gentleman in the back who asked about energy storage, we don't really have that as a viable technology yet. That's one area where we could make further reductions, because right now the option on the table is more natural gas turbines. And when you've taken all the carbon out of the system otherwise, the remaining emissions from natural gas backup generation is actually pretty significant. So focusing on the electric sector, we identified at large scale essentially 3 low carbon or zero carbon technologies that could deliver that 2050 energy demand and have minimal or zero reliance on fossil fuels with emissions. So they are renewables, of course, nuclear energy, and fossil energy that has carbon capture and storage, basically taking 90% of the carbon out of the exhaust stream and putting it underground somewhere. We looked at all these technologies because we said, why not? You know, these are all low carbon technologies. There's challenges for all of them. We're not going to leave one off just because some committee members don't think that it's going to happen, or we don't like it, or we think that the legislative hurdles are too big. An example is nuclear, where we're actually prevented from building new nuclear plants in California because we don't have a federal waste disposal pathway. So if that changes, and we either develop that policy or we change the law in California, this could be an option. But there's obviously other concerns about nuclear power, not the least of which is public sentiment. And the challenges for carbon sequestration is basically that we don't have a fully integrated system that is demonstrated and works today. And there's a lot of permitting challenges, as well as just the slow ramp-up time before we could even start to see that. But it does have the promise of significant, contribution to a 2050 energy grid if we wanted to go that way. But we also looked at what would happen if we did all of it from renewables. And compared to the 33% target that we've been talking about, this is essentially 90% or so of the generation would come from renewables. The balance would be from natural gas turbines. Maybe we could reduce that further. And about 70% of this would be from intermittent sources, primarily wind and solar. So we looked at what that would mean for balancing. So load balancing. So we essentially have 3 basic options for dealing with the differences between supply and demand at any given time. We are relying almost exclusively on natural gas right now. And It's available, it's a mature technology, it has emissions. It's also incidentally not that cheap to operate. The options that bring down the emissions have challenges of their own. We've got energy storage, clearly a very important technology, but it's currently very expensive and not really technically proven at the fully commercial scale. There's a lot of promise for bringing these costs down, but we don't know whether that's going to be the technology of choice now. Other people say, no, you know what, we can do it all just by making more of our loads flexible. We can ramp down factory output, we can turn off your refrigerator for a half hour at a time, we can pre-cool buildings, and all of that's true, but it's a much more difficult system to implement, and we don't really know how much capacity there is because we've never done a large-scale experiment. So this is, again, a big unknown, very promising, but don't know how far it is. So in our modeling, we just sort of assumed that about half of our energy balancing would come from technologies like this, and half would still come from natural gas, and we looked at the emissions. So after looking at those three options, we said, well, okay, technically they're all possible. There's enough uranium, there are enough CO2 storage sites, there are enough renewable resources in the state too, and that includes, limits. We're not growing the geothermal resource, for instance, very much. There's very little new hydro that's being built, but there's plenty of wind and certainly solar resources around the state. And we don't even have to get it all from the state. We can import too. But looking at a balanced portfolio where we look at about equal parts of the three seemed to be the most robust choice from the point of view of reliability. You have a lot more base load. It also is sort of a path of least resistance in terms of meeting but not exceeding the current RPS. So, emissions from load balancing are still significant even here. I guess the other thing I want to say is that if you, taking a step back, if you look at a system that is almost entirely renewables, the emissions from load balancing, if you don't have energy storage and much flexible demand, the emissions there are almost as big as the entire state target in 2050, which tells you why it's so hard to get down to that level when you still have emissions from the transportation sector. So that was a big surprise for us, but we believe it, and it really just shows the size of the challenge that running natural gas is fine in 2020. It's not going to be fine by 2050. So I was asked to talk about the bigger picture, so I'm also going to briefly just mention what we did on the fuel side, really focusing on biofuels since that's the most significant contribution here anyway. But our assessment of the demand for fuel in the case where we had a significant amount of natural gas with carbon sequestration is about 37 billion gallons equivalent, basically what we use today for running our transportation infrastructure, but now we're including natural gas as well. All the natural gas for heating is essentially squeezed out of the system. Very little is left for industrial processes, all that's done with electricity. We still have a big fuel demand problem. This is how much we can't put carbon capture and sequestration on. Heavy-duty transport, we can't electrify very much of this. We can't run airplanes on electricity or hydrogen, and we need some of it for these other things as well. And so the question is, how much biomass do we have? Can we meet it all there? We did a pretty thorough assessment of all the waste biomass potential in the state. We focused on wastes because we didn't want to displace food. We understand what that's done with ethanol and corn prices in the Midwest. It's not a path forward, our biologists told us, and we really need to focus on the streams that are either not being used, grown on marginal land, or really just kind of thrown away right now. So we looked at all of these and we found that maybe we could get about 7.5 billion gallons of fuel that way, assuming advances in bioenergy conversion and high efficiency. So what this points to is, let's say we have a 27 billion gallon pie, about a quarter of it, a little less actually, would come from California biofuels. The reason is that some of this grown in remote places would probably be used to make electricity. So we made sure that we didn't take it all, but at least kept some of that for electricity, about 2 billion gallons. And then we assumed really kind of, because we had no better information, maybe another quarter could come from imports from other states or on the international biofuel market, assuming that optimistically that is robust. But we're left with about 50% that is still going to come from fossil fuels. And there, my friends, is the innovation. If we can figure out how to grow this slice of the pie, or reduce our overall demand for fossil fuels, or somehow reduce the carbon footprint of these fuels, that's where the rest of the reductions are going to go. And we feel that this California study is generalizable to the rest of the country and to other countries as well. So it isn't just a unique solution for our state, even though we are more blessed with renewable resources. I think I will skip this in the interest of time. We're looking at strategies getting the rest of the way there, but you can read the reports online. They're all publicly posted at ccst.us. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions for Jeffrey? Yes.
Can you explain the carbon sequestration? I know there's a project here, but it's specifically in kind of like a fault line area, very controlled. They're doing a lot of digester gas with the landfills. Since there's really kind of limited as to where you can sequester, what are you seeing the area where you can do that?
So the near term, where people see the most near term promise is in abandoned oil and gas wells, or in wells where the production is decreasing, but they could actually get a little bit more energy out of it if they put a gas like CO2 into it. So essentially, you're permanently storing the CO2 in exchange for getting a little bit more oil or gas out in the near term, and eventually it just becomes a storage site. Some environmentalists don't like that because they say, hey, you're just getting out more oil, you're not solving the problem, but oil is a global commodity. I won't comment my personal opinion about that, but that's where you can place some of the CO2. And then there are these saline aquifers under many parts of the state that are quite extensive and have a couple centuries worth of CO2 storage capacity there. The challenge is that they're not as well characterized, unlike oil and gas formations, because there was no economic value for them. But that's where they would go. So large underground formations that are sealed, the CO2 isn't going to come back out, but there's still a lot of technical challenges to really prove that out.
I have a question for you, actually. Okay. So in your opinion, it sounds like, or from the study, actually, it does sound like technology is a critical answer to some of these deficits that we see.
Yes.
How important is policy, U.S. federal policy, let's say, as well as California, but let's look at the broader perspective. How important is that to developing, to facilitating and accelerating the technology? And do you think that there's enough attention to that and enough resources being devoted to that at the moment?
I don't think there's enough resources being devoted to it. I mean, the U.S. federal government is placing an emphasis on energy storage technology, for instance, with their ARPA-E program. Also, sort of flexible grid technology is receiving a lot of attention, and those are two areas that I called out as being really important for our future electricity system. But there could be more. I think it's still early. I am looking 40 years out, but I'm sort of saying in some cases you really do need to start placing the investments now, because it's going to be there before we know it. And of course, there's a long pipeline. In terms of other policy that could encourage the type of movement that I've described, I think that we could have a policy that specifically encourages this electrification that I'm talking about. We have some push in the vehicle, light-duty vehicle sector, but we could push that in other sectors too. Buses are great examples of something that could run on electricity because they have limited range. Trains as well, and then of course buildings, which is completely off the table as far as policy. We're so wedded to natural gas as a clean and relatively cheap fuel right now that it's very difficult to change that trend.
And maybe the fracking research might help.
Fracking, unfortunately, I mean, from an environmental point of view, fracking unfortunately makes it very difficult to compete against it, because if the price is low, why would you choose something other than that? So there has to be, I think, more than just cheap electricity to make that shift happen. There has to be a state prioritization.